Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our podcast today, looking at how to use a podcasting service to host your work. I'm Linda Coburn, I'm the moderator today, and I'm going to set the scene and then hand over to Vic Turnbull, who's going to be our speaker this morning. I'll start by introducing you to the Space. So the webinar series is brought to you by the Space. And for those of you who don't know us, we're the UK's digital commissioning and development agency for the arts and cultural sector, recently taken up Ipsos status with the Arts Council. And we work across a whole range of organisations, helping them with their digital commissioning, helping to find and reach audiences. And so the webinar programme is really, in essence, thinking about some of the work that we do with those commissioned organisations, what people find really helpful and useful, sort of distilled for the whole sector. And this is part of that work. So that's about the Space. Today, Vic will introduce herself in more detail, but she is an associate with the Space and has recently been working on some of our audio projects. So again, she's sort of thought about some of the things that she does for those organisations and sort of bringing the best bits to you in this session. And a bit before Vic joins us, just about how we'll work today. So there's a few things to note. One is that the webinar is recorded. The presentation part of the webinar will be recorded and then available on our YouTube channel after the event, so that you could go back to it or recommend it to other people. If you want to use the captioning service, we've got Jen with us, our live captioner, and the information on how to set up captions are in the chat. And the other point really is about the chat. So because we use the webinar format, so your cameras aren't on and your microphones aren't on, we use the chat for questions. So Vic's going to run through her presentation, and then at the end we've got, after she's done that presentation, which is I think probably 15 minutes tops, then there's loads and loads of time for you to get into more specific and ask the details and ask the questions that you need to ask about podcast hosting. And that's it really. So I hope you really enjoy the session. I'm going to hand over to Vic now and she's going to introduce herself. So away you go, Vic.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm going to share my screen now to get this webinar started officially. So Linda, give me a thumbs up if you can see that big old yellow screen. Lovely, thank you. So podcast hosting. Well, before we get into the detail of podcast hosting, let's take a minute so I can introduce myself. I am the founder of a social enterprise called Mike Media. Microphone, it's short for microphone, not some fella called Mike. And we have been around since 2019, and we are a podcast production and training social enterprise. So we help people to learn how to create podcasts, and we also make podcasts for other people as well. And I've been obsessed with audio since I was very, very tiny, and it's all I've ever wanted to do is make nice things for people's ears. So we predominantly work with social impact organisations. So I like to call them the good eggs. And we have one purpose, is to help people to amplify their stories through high quality audio. Last year, we launched about 6 podcasts and taught around 600 people how to create a podcast as well. And so we work with the likes of the Co-op, Plan UK, the National Football Museum, Salford University, Manchester City Council, the Pankhurst Trust, lots and lots of good eggs. So I'm here to tell more good eggs, the whys and what fors of podcast hosting. And what we'll cover over the next half an hour or so is all the fundamentals that you'll need to know to get to grips with podcast hosting. And I like to call podcast hosting services your best buddy when it comes to podcasting. They are your best pal, and they make it easy for you to get your podcast out there. So when I'm talking about podcast hosting, I'm not going to use its full posh name, podcast hosting service. I'm just going to say podcast hosting. So when I do, I'm not going to be talking about the person that speaks on the podcast, which is the podcast host. I'll be talking about the service podcast hosting. So just wanted to clear that up right at the start before we get cracking. And when I do podcast workshops and I talk about podcast hosting, it's a step that a lot of people don't know about. It's like this mysterious step of how do podcasts end up on your phone? How do they start playing on my smart speaker? How do they end up playing in my car? And it's like, and I want to demystify that step for you today. And we call it, some people might call it podcast distribution. I'll call it getting it out there. People might want to say, how do I get my podcast on all podcast players? So the podcast players being the apps that we use to listen to podcasts. So if you've got an iPhone, you probably listen to podcasts on Apple Podcasts. You might listen to a podcast on Spotify. You might use Google Podcasts. You might use Castbox. So how do you get them on a podcast player? What is that mysterious step that you need to take? And more often than not, the reason why it's this mysterious step is that because you're so busy figuring out what tech you need and how to make your content sound fabulous that this step is not often thought about. But it's a step that I want you to be thinking about. If you do have a podcast or you're planning to create a podcast, pop this step into your project plan. And I'll be telling you about timings in a few slides' time. So to get your podcast on those podcast players, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Castbox, all those podcast players, you will need a podcast hosting service. Now, anyone, even my cat sat here on my lap, can get their podcast on Spotify. You don't need any special permission. You don't have to know the top dude at Spotify and take him out for lunch. Anyone can get on Spotify. Anyone can get on Apple Podcasts. Anyone can get on Google Podcasts. And over the years, as podcasting has become a lot more popular, there's a lot more podcasts around, that step has become simpler to do. And you've got your podcast hosting service to thank for that. So in this slide, it gives a visual representation in space form of how your podcast is distributed to the podcast players. So the apps that you listen to podcasts on. And you do that through a podcast hosting service. You choose one. And in a few slides' time, I will discuss with you how you make that decision or how you come to that choice of choosing just one podcast host. And they're websites. So it's not any software you download, it's a website. And what a podcast hosting service does fundamentally is it stores your audio. It's where you upload your audio that you've created. And what it does through a little bit of tech called an RSS feed, it will then distribute it to all the podcast players on your behalf for you. So it takes all the faff out of you trying to do that yourself. I'm not going to get into the detail about what an RSS feed is because you don't need to know really. It'll just complicate matters. But basically, I like to think of it as like a unique URL. So your podcast hosting service, whichever one you choose, will create for you this unique URL for your podcast, aka an RSS feed. And then what it does, very, very simply, is your podcast host will give that URL to Apple Podcasts. So they'll go, hi, Apple Podcasts, I've got this new podcast, do you want it? And Apple Podcasts will go, yeah, I'll have that. And then it'll do that to Google Podcasts. It'll do it to all the podcast platforms. And then there you go. You're ready. So basically what your podcast host is doing is creating a connection between your podcast, your audio that lives on the podcast hosting website and to all the podcast players. Very easy. So everything that you see on a podcast player is taken, is sent from the podcast hosting service, and then it's sent to a a podcast player using that RSS feed, and your host does that for you. So think of it like Spider-Man. I've never used this analogy before. It's just come to my head. Spider-Man, when he casts his web out of his hands, that's what your podcast service is doing with your podcast. It is shooting your podcast to all the podcast players. So let's take a step back. To set up a podcast host for the first time, and if we think about what I've just said, that everything that you see on a podcast player, so everything that you see in Apple Podcasts about that podcast lives on your podcast host. So there is a setup process that you'll need to go through to initially set up your podcast on a podcast host. And to do that, as you've seen if you're on Apple, you've seen on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, podcasts have some cover art. It's like an album cover art for your podcast. So that lives on your host. So for the first time you're setting up your podcast host with your podcast, you'll need some cover art. You'll need a podcast description, which is about your podcast. So when you are looking on Apple Podcasts, you're looking on Spotify, you'll see the podcast that you're listening to will have a description and it'll have cover art, and that lives on your host. You'll need an idea of what category your podcast is going to fit into. And your podcast hosting service is very helpful in this respect. It'll give you a drop-down menu and you select the best category of which your podcast falls into. There are over 70 podcast categories. And it's very, you can figure out which one. If you're a football podcast, you're not going to put it into kids' podcasts. So it's as simple as that, really. And to set up your host, you will also need a piece of audio. So that's what you need for the first time when you go and set up your podcast on a podcast hosting service. And then what your podcast hosting service can then do is create this unique URL, and then it can help you to distribute it to the podcast players. Now, that initial setup, so that initial connection for the RSS feed to go to the podcast players, it's not instant. It's much swifter than it used to be, but it might take up to a week to show on all the top 3 podcast players. After it's connected, when you upload more audio, so you upload an episode and keep uploading episodes, it's instant, more or less. But for the initial setup, it might take up to a week to show on all the 3 big platforms, which is Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So bearing that in mind, factor that into the launch of your podcast. So say if you're going to launch your podcast on the 30th of June this year, don't set up your host on the same day. Because if you're directing people to listen on Apple Podcasts and they get there and your podcast is not there, then that's a bit of a disconnect. You won't get listeners on Apple Podcasts. So rule of thumb I always do is set up your podcast host up to 3 weeks before you launch your podcast. But you might be thinking, well, Vic, how can I have a piece of audio when I'm not going to launch my podcast till the 30th of June? I've got nothing to launch with. Well, this is where I've got nothing to set it up with. Well, this is where a trailer comes into play. You can create a 1 to 2 minute trailer about what's coming up in your brand new podcast and use that little bit of audio, that 1 to 2 minutes trailer, to set up your podcast host. So just to recap, set up your podcast host at least 3 weeks before you're due to launch your podcast. Use a trailer as that piece of audio to make that initial connection. And so you're allowing those 3 weeks for you to get on those podcast players. So for you to get on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. and Google Podcasts. Now you'll find as well that a lot of podcast players use Apple Podcasts feed in simple terms. So once you're on Apple Podcasts, you'll likely to show on a few other ones as well. It uses their feed. Podcast hosts make it very easy for you to that setup process. Some do a checklist, some do like a step-by-step process for you to follow. Like I said before, as podcasts have got more popular, hosts have developed and grown to make that process as simple as possible for you. So when that setup's done and you're on most of the platforms, especially Apple, Google, and Spotify, every time you upload an episode after that to your podcast host, you show up more or less instantly. So per episode, when you upload future episodes, you'll need your episode audio, you'll need show notes, which is the episode description for each episode. And if you're feeling particularly fancy, you can have some separate cover art or separate artwork for each of your episodes. But you don't need to, it's not necessary, it's only if you're feeling fancy. But for ease, just use the same artwork that's the cover art for your podcast. Let me have a wee sip of coffee before I give you the next slide. So let's have a little look into some of those, shall we? So a podcast description. A podcast description is what the whole podcast is about. So if we think about it in terms that I understand, it's Coronation Street, right? So Coronation Street is the stories of a street, characters on a street in a working class area of Manchester. So that description is about the whole of Coronation Street. The show notes is about each individual episode. So for Coronation Street terms, in this episode, Leanne breaks up with Nick. I do like Coronation Street. So your podcast description is, I like to call it, the back of your book. Or your whole book, basically. And this is what you upload. You have this onto your podcast hosting service. And it's editable. It's not set in stone. You can see what's working, see what's not working. You can edit it. That's fine. Your show notes is about that specific episode. So I'm sure you've heard podcasts that go, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. We'll put a link to your book in the show notes. This is where you can put in, as well as about the episode, perhaps, are there any social media links to the guests that you're having on, links to websites, references, useful stuff you've mentioned. If you have talked about issues that require extra support or helplines, you could put that in the show notes. You could put credits in there, fund a thanks. What I like to do with my clients is I set up a show notes template so they can use that cut and copy for each episode. So you'll have specific headers, and you might just have to change the top bit of it or the references bit of it. And on your podcast hosting service, you could do this on a Word doc. You could do show notes on a Word doc or your podcast description on a Word doc, and then copy and paste it into your podcast hosting service. So what do they look like on a podcast player? This is an example, a screen grab from Spotify, the web version of Spotify. So podcast description is about the whole thing. And the show notes or episode description is about that individual episode. Now, a fun little bit of advice that you will notice when I said this to you now is that when we're scrolling through podcast players, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, the podcast description will only show, what's that, the first 15 to 20 words, and then you have to click to see more. Same with your show notes. It'll show the first 12 to 20 words. So those first 12 to 20 words on your show notes and your podcast description is what I like to call valuable real estate. It is the first words that people will see if they're scrolling through a podcast player looking to listen to a podcast. So try not to put in those first 12 to 15 words. This is a podcast about. This is a podcast. You've lost 5 words there. Same with your show notes. In today's episode, we speak 6 words. Or in this week's episode, we're joined by Dave Smith. But your episode title is an interview with Dave Smith. Like you've already said it in the episode title. On a similar vein, some podcast descriptions start with, let's say, for example, the company. So it might start with, this is a podcast from Mike Media. Mike Media is the UK's only social enterprise. Nothing about the podcast. There's nothing, it's all about me, when it should be about the podcast. So consider that when you're writing your podcast description and show notes. How can you give the essence of what your podcast or episode is about in those first 12 to 20 words? That is easier said than done. I want to give you an example, and this is an example that might be hard to replicate, but an example of a podcast that spells it out in a beautiful, succinct way. I'm going to click this link, so there might be a delay with me clicking the link and it loading, but oh, black screen. Desert Island Discs, 8 tracks, a book, and a luxury. What would you take to Desert Island? Guests share the soundtrack of their lives. Beautifully simple. It doesn't start with, this is a podcast from Radio 4. BBC Radio 4 is a blah, 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 blah. Very, very succinct. Let me whack this onto full screen again for you. Give you the full viewing pleasure. So the next thing to consider, I said the cover art is what you upload to your podcast hosting service. Well, if we remember that everything that you see on a podcast player stems from your podcast host. Cover art. The biggest thing to consider when you are designing cover art for your podcast is, can it be legible, can't say it, legible on a tiny, tiny screen? And that tiny, tiny screen is your phone. So not too many fancy fonts, not too many colors, not too many. Sometimes when we have funded projects, we want to put all the funder logos. You won't be able to see them. It'll just look like blobs. If it's celebrity led or it's about a known person, whack them on the front cover. I think there are 3 things that someone will choose your podcast to listen to over another. That's your cover art, your podcast description, and your title of your podcast, which I'm probably not going to go into in this session. There's a fantastic program if you've not heard of it already, and there is a freemium version that you can have access to so many things for free, and also there's a not-for-profit discount as well, and that's called Canva, and that's CANVA. Canva makes you look like a graphic design genius with very minimal effort. They provide templates for everything from Facebook covers to YouTube covers and podcasts as well. So if you search into Canva podcast cover template, they'll throw something back at you that you can manipulate and change to your brand or logo. Another thing about cover art that I've noticed, and I think it's another little fun fact, is thus. This is the podcast charts from about a month ago, actually. And I had to, the UK Apple podcast charts, Great Britain, sorry, and I had to search to number 78 to find some imagery on a podcast cover art that had images or icons of headphones or a microphone. You don't need on your podcast cover art a microphone, an image of a microphone, an icon, or any headphones. It's unnecessary. A colleague of mine said, oh, it's like putting a pen on the front of your book, which I thought was lovely. Unless it's a podcast about podcasting, then go ahead, Gamad. So I want to give you a live example of a podcast host and what they look like backstage. And this is for a podcast that I made for a beautiful community group in Oldham called That Inspire Feeling last year. So I'm going to give you an example backstage of a podcast host. And this podcast host is called Spotify for Podcasters. You might have heard of it from its previous name that changed about a month ago. It was called Anchor, Anchor. Spotify bought the company a couple of years ago and they've now rebranded it as Spotify for Podcasters. So let me show you the backstage view of Spotify for Podcasters. So give me a sec while it loads up. I don't know why it's taking so long this morning. Hey, so this is when I log in as That Inspire Feeling to Spotify for Podcasters. Only I can see this, or whoever's got the password for Spotify for Podcasters. This is not, the public can't see this, but this is where That Inspire Feeling lives. This is Spotify for Podcasters, which is a podcast hosting service. So the backstage view, and you come up with your dashboard, and it gives you an overview of how many plays it's had in total. So your podcast host, as well as hosting your podcast and distributing it, every podcast host provides statistics. And if you're a geek like me, it's insightful stuff, but it's not there just for statistics' sake. It can show you how you're performing, and I'll move on to that in a second, actually. So this is backstage, That Inspire Feeling. It shows you a brief overview of your stats. And also, now this podcast, for transparency, hasn't released an episode since March last year. So you've got options at the top. So this is the home of my backstage area. We've got analytics, so we can have a deeper view of the analytics, and it's very clever stuff. So the statistics on a podcast host combines your listening from all the podcast players. So this is not just showing Spotify, it's showing everywhere where your podcast is distributed, and it reflects it on your podcast host. So, gives you fancy graphs. You can tell where your peaks are. You can set the time where you want to look at your statistics, and you can go deeper into them by clicking the sub-menus within the analytics tool. So you can tell where they're coming from, what platforms they're using to listen, and so whether so for here they're just listening on listening on Spotify and the web browser. That might contain Apple Podcasts, it might contain the other podcast players as well. And this is something unique to Spotify for Podcasters. It'll feed in stats from the people that are listening via Spotify, and it's showing you that from the 83% that are listening on Spotify, 100% of them in this case are female, and they are either over 60 or between 35 and 44. And the reason why Spotify have got that data is because obviously when you sign up to Spotify, you give them that data. You don't do that when you're listening to podcast, or you might do on Apple Podcasts. Maybe you don't Apple Podcasts, but because this is affiliated with Spotify, it's giving you those in-depth stats. And then it also shows you how well each episode is ranking as well. So which episode is performing best. And I'm actually very proud of these analytics for that Inspire Feeling. It was a limited series. It's coming back later on this year. And for a tiny but mighty community, women's community group in Oldham, to receive 283 listens on their podcast is pretty good going. So that's the analytics menu. We can go into the episodes menu at the top. And this is a list of episodes that we have published. And it also tells you the plays of those as well. Two features that Spotify for Podcasters has released that may sway you to use this over another podcast hosting service is the last two options here, Interact and Money. Interact gives you the option within only for listeners on Spotify to do Q&As with your audience, with your listener, or to do polls, much like you do on Facebook or Twitter. So in your podcast, you can say, if you're listening on Spotify, see the poll on the player and let us know what you think. But that's only for people that are listening on Spotify. And then the last one is Money. Spotify for Podcasters offers the opportunity for you to release paid for content. So you can get subscribers to your podcast who pay to access exclusive content that non-paid listeners can access. And that's something that you probably won't think about at the very, very start of making your podcast. It might be something that you think about when you start getting a number of listeners. So it's something probably not to think about at this stage in time. But the three main menus are Home, Analytics, and Episodes. To upload a new episode, you simply hit New Episode, and Spotify for Podcasters is interesting in that you can create an episode in Spotify for Podcasters. You can record and edit within there. It's a nice one-stop service. But if you've already recorded something previously and edited it on another editing software, you simply upload an episode from here. And it's asking me to upload some audio, which I'm not going to do. And that's where you upload your show notes and the title of your podcast and all stuff like that. And then there's a settings menu, and this is where you can obviously this podcast has already been set up. So Spotify for Podcasters, when you initially set your podcast up, takes you through a bit of a one of those checklists like I mentioned before. Podcast availability is where you start distributing your podcast. So here is the RSS feed that I was telling you about. And down below are all the platforms that Spotify for Podcasters helps you get onto. So you'll click one and it'll tell you how to submit it to the podcast players. Ooh. Can we still see my screen, Linda? Amazing. So like I say, this setup is the bit that takes time to allow 3 weeks for this distribution. It's called podcast availability on Spotify for Podcasters. So I'll just click settings actually, just to show you what this looks like. So podcast name, that Inspire Feeling, podcast description. Spotify Podcasters is actually good for making you be succinct with your description. So it only lets you have 600 characters. And I quite like that, actually. It helps you to become succinct and to the point that I was mentioning before. This is the cover art. the categories that I was telling you about, and all the guff about the account settings. So let me just click off that a second. I'm going to show you what that Inspire Feeling looks like on Spotify. And I'll show you this. This is an example of how what goes onto your podcast host mirrors what goes onto the podcast player. So here we go. We've got the description there that we uploaded onto Spotify for podcasters. We've got the cover art, and we've got each individual episode. So for this podcast, they actually for the first 4, they created the a bespoke cover art for each episode. And then we've got what it looks like on Apple Podcasts as well, on the web browser. So set out slightly different. I mean, they're all the podcast players are set out slightly differently. So you've got your podcast description there, and you've got the show notes here. So some final tips: allow 3 weeks before you launch to set up your host. The 3 main platforms, the 3 main platforms that people listen to podcasts are Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. So make sure that you're on those 3. Amazon Podcasts is important as well, because if people want to listen to you via your Alexa, then you'll want to be on there as well. When you are, and most of the podcast hosting services will let you, like much like you can schedule social media posts, you can schedule when your podcast is released. So let's say that you release your podcasts every Wednesday, then you can bulk record and schedule your episodes to release every Wednesday. Now, I always release my episodes very, very early in the morning, 3-4 a.m. on the day of release. Because if there is any delay of it going on Apple Podcasts or any delay of it showing on Spotify, it'll happen while people are asleep. So I wouldn't give I might schedule it for about 3 or 4 a.m. that morning of the release. Very rarely there is much of a delay, but I use that as a bit of a buffer. So when we're sharing our podcast, maybe on our socials, our newsletters, our websites, because you're potentially going to be on 50 podcast players. It's going to be a lot of information for you to share all the URLs that you're on. Listen on Apple here, listen on Spotify here, listen on Amazon here. You can't fit that into a tweet. So there are services where you can create a magic link, one magic link. And one that I use is Podfollow. There are other ones. And that one magic link, you can set it so that it'll open on the podcast player that's linked to that device, if you know what I mean. So if someone clicks that link on a Mac or an iOS device, it'll open in Apple Podcasts. If they're clicking it on an Android phone, or it'll open on Google Podcast or Spotify. If they're clicking it on a web browser, it can open in something else. So you can set that as well. They can be just showing that one magic link on socials. So you're not going, listen here, listen here. You'll see often as well, people say, listen on Apple Podcasts. Not everyone's got an iPhone. I've not got an iPhone, so I can't listen on Apple Podcasts. So consider your listener as well, or your audience in that. Second to last, and what you're probably all asking is, well, how do I choose a podcast hosting service? There is loads out there. And like I mentioned before, this is one of the hottest topics in podcast land. If you go on any Facebook group that's related to podcasting, this is probably the question that they get asked the most, and the question they most often block because too many people are asking it. They all offer the fundamental service. Every podcast host will get you on all the podcast players. They'll all offer stats, and they'll all offer an embed player that you can then put onto your website. So much like you can embed a YouTube video onto your website, you can do that with a podcast host as well. So 3 questions then to ask yourself is, what's your budget? Podcast hosting services start at £0, $0, and can go up to something like $20 a month. So what's your budget, first of all? Second of all, how often are you releasing episodes, and how long are they? So some podcast hosts start charging if you go over a certain amount of hours a month, or they'll start charging when it starts the size of what you're uploading goes over a certain amount a month. And you can understand that the cost comes with obviously their hosting costs, some storage costs or whatnot. So that's where the cost comes in. And much like everything in life, you start paying for things when there's more bells and whistles. So consider, what do you need at this stage? If you're just starting out, you probably just need those 3 fundamental things. So other bells and whistles include, perhaps they've got the option to transcribe your episode. Maybe they've got plugins to help you create social media content. Maybe they make it easy for you to insert ads if you want to, or monetize your podcast. More often than not, though, that stuff comes down the line. You don't need to worry your head about those things now. You just want a hosting service that's going to get you out there, give you stats, and give you an embed player. I find that people worry about stuff that they don't need to worry about at this stage when you're just at the beginning of starting a podcast. So saying that, it's easy to move hosts. And when I've moved hosts in the past, my current podcast hosting service and my new one gives you very clear instructions on how to move hosts. The only thing that you'll lose, you won't lose any of your content, you'll just lose your stats. So just make a note of them onto a spreadsheet, and then they'll start again on your new host. So moving host doesn't look any different to the listener, just backstage it's different to you. One of the things that a podcast host might offer is something called dynamic content. And I've moved hosts when my podcasts become 3 years down the line. I moved podcast hosts because my current one didn't offer this service. And just after 3 years, I wanted this service. I didn't want it straight away. We didn't need it straight away, but after 3 years, I wanted this service. And what this is that you might see as dynamic ad insertion. And what this functionality is that we've all heard podcast adverts, right? They come at the beginning, they come in the middle, they come at the end. Pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll. So what dynamic content is your podcast host will let you insert content into your podcast at a specific point in that podcast. And you can set it up in your host to play for a certain amount of time, well, a certain duration of time, for a certain, so for a month, and it'll slot it in where you say, and it'll pull it out when you say. So this is good for if you've got a sponsor, you want to put an ad in, say you've said to your sponsor, you can be in my episodes for a month in the mid-roll, and then you can set it for a month and it'll take it out. If they don't offer that functionality, then you'd have to, what I call baking it into your episodes. There's no option you'd have to manually then edit it out and re-upload it. So it might be something you might want to consider down the line, is how you can put in dynamic content. It might be that you've got an event coming up and you want to advertise your event on your 5 most recent episodes for 5 weeks, and then that's when your event is, then you can just take it out. To do that manually, you'd have to put the advert in all the episodes, upload the audio. When that 5 weeks is done, take the audio down, re-upload it without the advert in it. So that's dynamic content. And that is podcast hosting 101.